The moment the gentleman's eyes slid past Eleanor Whitmore and landed on her younger sister, she knew exactly how the rest of the evening would go. It always went this way. She stood near the edge of the ballroom in her pale gray gown, holding a glass of lemonade she had no intention of drinking, and watched Lord Pembroke bow low over Margaret's gloved hand, as if Eleanor were no more than a curtain behind her. She did not mind, or rather, she had trained herself not to mind, the way one trains oneself to ignore a draft that never quite leaves a cold house. 3 seasons. 3 long seasons of standing beside her sisters while suitors arranged themselves like courtiers before a queen, all of them reaching for Margaret's bright laugh or Charlotte's golden curls, none of them sparing more than a polite nod for the sister in between. She had grown skilled at reading a room the way a general reads a battlefield, and tonight the battlefield told her nothing had changed. Her mother, Lady Whitmore, appeared at her elbow with the particular brightness in her eyes that meant she had been counting suitors again, tallying them like coins. "Lord Pembroke danced with Margaret twice last week," her mother murmured, fanning herself. "Twice, Eleanor. If he asks a third time, people will begin to talk of an understanding." "That would be good news for the family," Eleanor said, and meant it. Their father had been gone 2 years now, and the estate he left behind was more debt than land. A good match for any of the 3 sisters would ease a burden that pressed harder each month, though her mother rarely spoke of money where servants might overhear. "Good news for the family," her mother repeated, a little wistfully, and did not finish the thought. They both knew whose marriage would matter more, and whose would matter less. Eleanor excused herself before the silence could turn heavier, and made her way toward the long windows at the far end of the room, where the candlelight thinned, and the noise of the crowd softened into something bearable. She liked this spot. From here she could watch the whole glittering theater of the season without being asked to perform in it. She was still watching when the doors at the top of the staircase opened, and the entire room seemed to draw one collective breath. She recognized him at once, though she had never stood close enough to speak to him. Julian Ashford, Duke of Camden, was not a man one needed introductions for. His name had circled the drawing rooms of London all season like a rumor that refused to die down, attached to a fortune so large it barely needed mentioning, and a reputation for choosing solitude over society whenever he could manage it. Mothers had been maneuvering their daughters into his path for months with no success. He attended few balls, danced with fewer partners, and left early from nearly every event he graced with his presence. Tonight, he did not look like a man planning to leave early. He paused at the top of the stairs, surveying the room with an expression Eleanor could not quite name, something between assessment and search, and then he began to descend. Every woman in the ballroom seemed to straighten at once. Fans stilled mid-wave. Conversations dropped to whispers. Eleanor watched her sister Margaret's face light with anticipation, watched Charlotte's gloved hands tighten slightly on her dance card, watched Louisa Grant, the acknowledged beauty of the season, glide almost imperceptibly closer to the center of the room, where any approaching gentleman would be certain to see her first. The Duke crossed the floor. He did not stop at the center of the room. He did not stop near Louisa Grant, whose smile had already begun to form in anticipation, or near Margaret, whose laugh had grown just slightly louder, the way it always did when she sensed an audience worth impressing. He walked past all of them, past the cluster of eligible young women arranged like a garden in full bloom, past the mothers angling their daughters a few degrees toward his path, and he did not slow until he reached the window where Eleanor stood, half hidden by shadow and curtain, holding a glass of lemonade she still had not touched. "Miss Whitmore," he said. For a moment, Eleanor thought he must have mistaken her for someone else. She glanced behind her, half expecting to find another woman standing in the shadow of the curtain, but there was no one. Only her, and the astonished silence spreading outward through the room like ripples on still water. "Your Grace," she managed, and dropped into a curtsy that felt clumsier than any she had performed in years, because her legs had gone strangely unreliable beneath her. "I wonder if you would do me the honor of the next dance." It was not a question anyone refused, not to a duke, not in a room full of witnesses who would talk of nothing else for a week, regardless of her answer. And yet Eleanor hesitated, searching his face for the joke, the wager among gentlemen that sometimes sent one of them toward the plainest woman in the room on a dare. She had heard of such things happening to other unremarkable women at other unremarkable balls. She braced herself for the laughter that would surely follow. But his expression held nothing of amusement. If anything, he looked faintly impatient, as though her hesitation puzzled him more than her sister's beauty ever could have. "Of course," she said, because there was truly nothing else to say, and placed her gloved hand in his. The walk to the center of the floor felt endless. She could feel the eyes on her back. could hear the whispers rising like steam from a kettle just beginning to boil, and beneath it all she was aware, with painful clarity, of her mother's face somewhere near the punch table, frozen in an expression of pure disbelief. The music began. He was, she noted with some surprise, an excellent dancer, precise and unhurried, guiding her through the steps with none of the awkward pauses she had grown used to from partners more interested in glancing over her shoulder at her sisters than in the dance itself. He looked directly at her. He did not once let his gaze drift toward Margaret, or Charlotte, or Louisa Grant, or any of the dozen women who had spent the entire season waiting for exactly this moment to happen to them instead. "You seem surprised," he said, after a long moment of silence between them. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I did not expect to be asked." "Why not?" The question was so direct, so entirely without the practiced flattery she had come to expect from gentlemen making conversation, that she nearly laughed. "I have 2 younger sisters, Your Grace, both accounted great beauties of the season. Gentlemen do not typically cross a ballroom to reach me when they might reach them instead." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker she could not read. "I did not cross the room for your sisters." "Then may I ask what you did cross it for?" He did not answer immediately, and something in his silence told her the question had landed somewhere she had not intended, somewhere private and guarded. "That," he said finally, "is a longer conversation than one dance allows." The music ended before she could press him further. He bowed. She curtsied. And then, instead of releasing her hand and moving on to seek out another partner as custom and courtesy demanded, he held it a moment longer than necessary. "I hope to call on your family soon, Miss Whitmore," he said, quietly enough that only she could hear it. "There is something I should have told your father, a long time ago. I mean to set it right." Before she could ask what he meant, he had bowed once more and turned away, leaving her standing alone at the center of the ballroom floor with every eye in the room fixed upon her, and no earthly idea what had just happened, or why the most sought-after man in England had looked at her as though she, and not her sisters, was the reason he had come at all. Her mother reached her within seconds, her fan trembling in her hand, her voice a fierce and delighted whisper. "Eleanor, Eleanor, what did he say to you?" Eleanor watched the Duke's dark head move through the crowd toward the doors, already leaving, exactly as everyone had said he always did, except that tonight he was leaving having danced with only one woman in the entire room. "I do not know," she said honestly, "but I intend to find out." Margaret arrived a moment later, breathless, her curls slightly disordered from an earlier reel, her eyes wide with a curiosity that held no trace of unkindness. Of her 2 sisters, Margaret had always been the gentler one, quick to laugh but never at another's expense, and now she caught Eleanor's hands in both of hers. "The Duke of Camden," she said, as though testing the words aloud to see if they were real. "Eleanor, he has not danced with anyone this whole season. Lady Marsh told me he refused an introduction to Louisa Grant not 2 weeks ago at the Ashcombe ball. And tonight he walked straight past her to reach you." "I noticed," Eleanor said dryly. Charlotte joined them next, her expression harder to read, something caught between admiration and the faint sting of having been overlooked herself. She said nothing unkind, only studied Eleanor with new interest, as though seeing her sister for the first time in years. What could he possibly have meant, calling on father? Father has been gone 2 years. "I do not know that either," Eleanor admitted. The words the Duke had spoken circled in her mind, refusing to settle into any shape she understood. "Something I should have told your father, a long time ago. What business could a duke of such standing have had with a modest, debt-burdened baronet who had never moved in circles anywhere near as elevated as Camden's own?" Across the room she caught sight of Louisa Grant watching her with an expression that had abandoned all pretense of civility. It was only a glance, gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the beauty's usual composed smile as she turned back to her circle of admirers, but Eleanor recognized the look for what it was. She had felt something like it herself, over 3 long seasons of being passed over. She understood, better than most in that ballroom, exactly how much it could sting to watch someone else receive the attention you believed belonged to you. The carriage ride home was unlike any other Eleanor could remember. Usually the journey home from a ball was a quiet, sleepy affair, her sisters recounting compliments received and steps missed, her mother offering gentle corrections on posture and conversation. Tonight her mother could speak of nothing but the dance, replaying it from every possible angle, wondering aloud what connection could exist between the Duke of Camden and a family so far beneath his notice. "Perhaps it is a business matter," her mother mused, twisting her gloves in her lap. "Your father did have dealings with men of business before he passed. Investments, debts owed both ways." Perhaps, Eleanor said, though privately she doubted it. There had been something in the Duke's eyes when he spoke of her father, something that looked less like business and more like an old weight he had been carrying for a long time and finally decided to set down. She thought, too, of the way he had looked at her throughout their dance, directly and without the wandering attention she had grown accustomed to from other partners. He had asked her nothing about her sisters. He had not once inquired after the family's connections or the size of any dowry, questions that formed the backbone of nearly every conversation she had ever had with an eligible gentleman. He had simply looked at her, as though she were the only person in the room worth looking at, and she did not yet know what to make of the strange, unfamiliar warmth that memory left behind. By the time the carriage reached their modest townhouse on a quiet, unfashionable street far from the grand addresses of Mayfair, Eleanor had resolved to say nothing more of her confusion, at least not tonight. But as she climbed the stairs to her room, her mother's voice followed her, filled with a note of hope Eleanor had not heard in a very long time. Whatever the reason, Eleanor, do not dismiss it. A man like that does not cross a ballroom on a whim. Eleanor said nothing, but long after the candles were extinguished and the house had gone silent around her, she lay awake turning his words over and over in her mind, and found she could not disagree. By noon the following day, word of the dance had traveled through half of London. Eleanor learned this the way one learns most things in her mother's house, by the sheer volume of callers arriving before she had finished her morning tea. Lady Marsh came first, ostensibly to discuss a charity subscription, though she spent the entire visit steering the conversation back toward the Duke of Camden, with the persistence of a woman who could not bear to leave a room without answers. 2 more neighbors followed within the hour, each with some flimsy excuse for calling, and each unable to disguise their curiosity once seated in the drawing room. Her mother handled every visit with a composure Eleanor had rarely seen from her, offering vague, pleasant nothings about the Duke's excellent manners, and saying nothing at all about the strange remark he had made concerning their father. Eleanor was grateful for her mother's restraint, mostly because she had no explanation to offer either, and every unanswered question only sharpened her own curiosity further. "You look as though you have not slept," Charlotte observed, settling beside her once the last caller had finally departed. "I have not, particularly." "Thinking of him?" "Thinking of what he said," Eleanor corrected. "There is a difference." Charlotte studied her for a long moment, and something softened in her expression, an understanding Eleanor had not expected from a sister who spent most seasons competing rather than confiding. "Whatever he wants, Eleanor, I hope it is good for you. You have waited long enough for someone to look at you the way he did last night." The words caught Eleanor off guard, and for a moment she did not know how to answer them. She had spent 3 seasons believing her sisters scarcely noticed her at all, so absorbed were they in their own admirers and their own small triumphs. To hear Charlotte name the particular loneliness Eleanor had carried in silence for so long, and to hear it spoken with something like tenderness rather than pity, undid her more than she expected. "Thank you," she said quietly, and left it there, because anything more would have brought tears she had no wish to explain to anyone. The Duke called 3 days later. He arrived precisely on time, dressed with the same understated elegance he had worn at the ball, and greeted Eleanor's mother with a courtesy so correct it left no room for gossip, however much the servants might wish otherwise. Eleanor received him in the small drawing room, her mother positioned nearby with the studied casualness of a chaperone pretending not to listen to every word. "Miss Whitmore," he said, bowing over her hand, "thank you for receiving me. You did say you intended to call, Your Grace. I confess I have thought of little else since." A faint smile touched his mouth, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "I imagine my sudden interest has caused a great deal of talk." "An understatement, Your Grace. My mother received 3 callers before noon yesterday, each pretending to discuss a subscription for the poor while asking me nothing but questions about you." He laughed at that, a low, unguarded sound that seemed to surprise even him. It was the first time Eleanor had heard him laugh, and something in her chest loosened slightly at the sound of it, as though a door she had not realized was locked had swung open a few inches. "Would you walk with me in the garden?" he asked. "What I have to say is better said with fewer walls listening." Her mother, overhearing despite her pretense otherwise, gave the smallest of nods, and Eleanor rose to fetch her shawl. The garden behind their townhouse was modest, nothing like the sprawling grounds she imagined surrounded his own estates, but it was private enough, bordered by high hedges that muffled the sound of the street beyond. They walked in silence for a while, past the last of the autumn roses before he finally spoke. "Your father and mine were once close friends," he said. "Before either of us was born, or nearly so. They served together, briefly. in circumstances I will not trouble you with in detail. What matters is that your father, in a moment of considerable danger, made a choice that saved my father's life." Eleanor stopped walking. "I never knew that. My father spoke rarely of his younger years. My father spoke of it often, though only to me, and only in his final months. He made me promise that if ever the chance arose, I would repay the debt to your family, whatever form that repayment might take. I did not know, when I made that promise, that your father had already passed, or that the family he left behind included 3 daughters I had never met. And so you came to the ball to find us." "I came to the ball to find you. Specifically, once I learned which of the 3 daughters carried your father's temperament most closely. Your father was not a man who sought attention for himself, my father told me. He was quiet, careful, more interested in doing what was right than in being seen doing it. When I asked after each of you before the ball, it was your name that kept returning to me, described in exactly those terms by people who knew your family well." Eleanor felt something complicated rise in her chest, gratitude tangled together with a sharper, less comfortable feeling she could not immediately name. "So you sought me out because I remind you of my father, not because of anything particular to me." He turned to face her fully, and there was nothing evasive in his gaze. "That was my reason for approaching. I will not pretend otherwise, but it was not my reason for staying at your side the entire evening, nor is it my reason for standing in this garden now, when I might have discharged my debt with considerably less effort. A letter of introduction. An invitation to a lesser event. There were simpler ways to repay an old promise than crossing a crowded ballroom in front of half of London. Then why did you choose the harder way?" "Because the moment I spoke to you, Miss Whitmore, I found I did not want the evening to end." The words hung between them, quiet and unadorned, entirely unlike the practiced flattery she had grown so tired of hearing from other men. She did not know how to answer him, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the only sound the rustle of the last roses in the autumn wind. "I do not know what to make of you, Your Grace," she finally admitted. "Julian," he said, "if we are to speak this plainly with one another, I would prefer you use my name." "Julian, then." She tested the name and found she liked the shape of it. "I do not know what to make of you, Julian. A duke who seeks out the overlooked daughter instead of the celebrated ones. A man who speaks of old debts and dead fathers within minutes of meeting me properly. It is not what I expected from a man of your reputation." "What did you expect?" "Someone colder, I suppose. Someone who danced with me on a whim and would forget my name by morning. I have forgotten a great many things in my life, Miss Whitmore. I do not believe your name will be among them." They continued their walk in a silence that had turned comfortable rather than strained, and by the time they returned to the house, something had shifted between them, subtle but unmistakable, the beginning of an understanding neither of them had quite named aloud. Word of the visit spread nearly as quickly as word of the dance had. By the following week, invitations that had once overlooked the Whitmore family entirely began arriving in greater numbers, and Eleanor found herself the subject of speculation everywhere she went. No longer the sister standing quietly in the shadow of the other two, but a woman whose name was spoken with new and careful interest. Not everyone received the change with goodwill. At a musical evening hosted by Lady Ashcombe, Eleanor felt the weight of Louisa Grant's attention long before the woman approached her directly. Louisa was, by any measure, the acknowledged beauty of the season, golden-haired and confident, accustomed to a kind of attention Eleanor had never known, and had stopped expecting to know. When she finally crossed the room during the interval, her smile was perfectly pleasant and entirely without warmth. "Miss Whitmore, how fortunate you have been this season." "I am not certain fortune is quite the word for it, Miss Grant." "No? The Duke of Camden has called on your family twice this week, I am told. Quite a remarkable turn of events, for a family so recently forgotten by society." Louisa's smile did not waver, though something sharpened behind her eyes. "I do hope his interest is not merely a passing curiosity. Men of his standing sometimes amuse themselves with novelty before returning, quite sensibly, to matches better suited to their position." "I appreciate your concern," Eleanor said evenly, refusing to let the barb land where it was aimed. "Though I find I am not overly troubled by what is or is not sensible for a man to decide for himself." Louisa's smile thinned further, but she said nothing more before excusing herself, and Eleanor watched her retreat across the room with an unsettled feeling she could not quite shake. There had been something beneath the pleasant words, a warning rather than idle gossip, and Eleanor found herself wondering, not for the first time, whether the season's sudden shift in her fortunes had made her an enemy as easily as it had made her the subject of admiration. She did not mention the exchange to Julian when he called again 2 days later. But she found herself watching the room more carefully at every gathering afterward, aware now that not every eye upon her carried goodwill, and that whatever was growing between herself and the Duke, it would not go unchallenged by those who believed his attention belonged elsewhere. That evening, once the musical entertainment had ended and the guests had begun drifting toward the refreshment tables, Eleanor found herself briefly alone near a tall window overlooking Lady Ashcombe's garden. She welcomed the quiet after the strange, unsettling exchange with Louisa Grant, and she used the moment to steady herself, watching the candlelight flicker against the dark glass. "You look troubled," a voice said behind her, and she turned to find Julian had crossed the room to join her, his expression attentive in a way that told her he had noticed more of the evening than she realized. "It is nothing," she said, though the words came out less convincing than she intended. "Miss Whitmore." His voice carried a gentle warning, as though he recognized deflection when he heard it. "I would rather you tell me the truth, even an uncomfortable one, than watch you carry something alone that I might help ease." She hesitated, weighing how much to share, before deciding there was little use in pretending. "Miss Grant suggested your interest in me might prove temporary, a novelty, she called it, before you returned your attention to a match more suited to your position." Something hardened briefly in his expression, though his voice remained even. "Miss Grant has spent this season assuming my attention belonged to her by right, long before I had exchanged a single word with her. I danced with no one this season until I danced with you. That was not an accident, and it was not a novelty." "I did not think it was," Eleanor said. "But I confess her words unsettled me more than I expected. I have spent 3 seasons being the sister no one noticed. I find I am not entirely certain how to trust being noticed now, particularly by someone whose attention every other woman in this room believes she deserves more than I do." Julian was quiet for a moment, considering her words with the same careful attention he seemed to bring to everything. "I cannot promise you that people will stop talking, or that Miss Grant will cease finding ways to remind you she is unhappy. But I can promise you that my regard for you has nothing to do with what anyone else believes I owe them, and everything to do with the conversations we have had these past days, each one convincing me further that I was right to cross that ballroom." "You make it sound very simple." "It is not simple at all," he admitted. "There are considerations beyond my own wishes, expectations from my family, questions of position and duty that a man in my place cannot entirely ignore. But none of those considerations have made me doubt my own mind where you are concerned, and I do not intend to let idle unkindness from a disappointed admirer change that either." Eleanor felt something in her chest ease slightly at his words, though the uncertainty Louisa had planted did not entirely disappear. She had learned, across 3 quiet seasons of watching from the edges of rooms like this one, that admiration could be a fragile and temporary thing, offered easily and withdrawn just as easily when something more appealing presented itself. She wanted to believe Julian was different. Everything in his manner suggested he was, and yet she had also learned not to trust too quickly in good fortune that arrived without warning, particularly when it arrived wrapped in the attention of a man so far above her in every practical measure society used to judge such things. "Thank you," she said finally, "for telling me plainly. I intend to always tell you plainly, Miss Whitmore. Whatever else changes between us, I would ask that you extend me the same courtesy in return. I believe I can manage that." He smiled at her answer, and for the remainder of the evening, whenever her gaze found his across the room, she felt steadier than she had upon first hearing Louisa's warning, though a small, wary part of her mind continued turning the words over regardless. Novelty. Passing curiosity, she did not believe them, not fully, but she found she could not entirely dismiss them either. And as the carriage carried her home beneath a sky heavy with early winter cloud, she wondered how much of the season ahead would be shaped by battles she had not yet seen coming. Winter settled over London slowly, and with it came a rhythm to Julian's visits that Eleanor found herself anticipating with an eagerness she had never known before. He called twice, sometimes 3 times a week, always with some reasonable excuse: a book he thought she might enjoy, an invitation to walk in a park less crowded than the fashionable promenades, a question about her father he claimed to have only just remembered. Eleanor suspected the excuses mattered less to him than the visits themselves, and she found she no longer minded the transparency of it. Her mother, for her part, had transformed almost entirely in her manner toward Eleanor. Where once Eleanor had been the quiet daughter mentioned last, if mentioned at all, she now found herself consulted on matters of the household, praised for opinions that would have gone unremarked a month earlier, and seated, without discussion, in the chair nearest the drawing-room fire that had once belonged, by unspoken tradition, to Margaret. Eleanor noticed the shift and found it left a strange taste in her mouth, gratitude tangled uncomfortably with something closer to hurt. She had wanted her mother's attention for years. To receive it now, so plainly tied to a duke's interest rather than anything Eleanor herself had done or said, felt less like a gift than a debt she had not asked to be paid. She mentioned this to Julian one afternoon as they walked through a quiet corner of Hyde Park, the bare trees stark against a pale winter sky, their breath visible in the cold air. "My mother speaks to me now as though I have always been her favorite," Eleanor said. "It is strange, being seen after so long unseen. I find I do not entirely trust it." "Do you think her affection false?" "I think it convenient," Eleanor said carefully, which is not quite the same thing as false, but close enough to sting. Julian considered this for a while before answering, his pace slowing to match the seriousness of the conversation. "I cannot speak to your mother's heart, only to what I have observed. She strikes me as a woman who has spent years frightened for her family's future, and fear does strange things to how people show love. It does not excuse overlooking you for 3 seasons, but I do not think it means she never cared, only that her caring was buried under worry she did not know how to carry any other way." Eleanor turned his words over slowly, surprised by how much they eased something in her chest she had not realized was tight. "You are generous with people, Julian. More generous than I expected from someone raised among the sort of society that rewards very little generosity at all. My father taught me that," he said, a shadow passing briefly over his face. "He believed a man's character was measured most honestly in how he treated people who could do nothing for him in return. It was part of why the debt to your father weighed so heavily on him. Your father saved his life, and asked for nothing afterward. Not money, not favor, not even acknowledgement. My father spent the rest of his years feeling he had never adequately repaid a debt that could not be measured in ordinary currency. And now you carry that same weight." "I did," Julian said, "though I confess the nature of it has changed considerably since the night I met you." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks despite the cold, and she looked away toward the frost-rimmed grass to hide her expression. "You are direct, Your Grace." "Julian," he corrected gently, "and I find directness serves better than the alternative, particularly with a woman who has spent 3 seasons watching men speak in circles around women they claim to admire." She could not argue with that, and they walked on in comfortable silence for a while, the cold air sharp and clean between them. It was during one such walk, some days later, that Eleanor first challenged him openly, and found, to her surprise, that he welcomed it rather than resented it. They had been discussing a matter of local charity, a subscription for a home meant to house orphaned children, and Julian mentioned, almost carelessly, his belief that such institutions function best when run with strict discipline, structure being, in his view, the surest kindness one could offer children who had known too little of it. "I disagree," Eleanor said, before she had entirely decided to say it aloud. Julian glanced at her, clearly startled, though not displeased. "Go on." "Structure without warmth is not kindness, Your Grace. It is merely order, and order alone does very little to heal a child who has lost everything familiar to them. I have visited such homes with my mother. The children who thrive are not the ones under the strictest discipline, but the ones who are shown, plainly and often, that someone notices them and wishes them well. Discipline without warmth teaches obedience. It does not teach a child they are worth loving." She half expected him to argue, or worse, to offer the polite, dismissive agreement she had received from countless gentlemen who found her opinions inconvenient to contradict. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something like genuine reconsideration. "I had not thought of it in those terms," he admitted finally. "I confess my own upbringing was heavy on structure and rather lighter on warmth, and I suppose I assumed the model had served me well enough to recommend to others. Has it served you well?" The question seemed to catch him off guard, and for a moment something vulnerable flickered across his face before he mastered it. "I have never been asked that quite so plainly. I did say I preferred directness." He laughed, low and genuine, and something in the sound told her she had touched a truth he did not often examine. "No," he said finally, "I do not think it served me particularly well, if I am honest. I learned discipline very thoroughly. I learned considerably less about how to sit with someone simply because their company brought me comfort, rather than because some duty demanded it." He paused, glancing at her sideways. "Present company accepted, evidently, since I find myself walking through a freezing park for the 3rd time this fortnight, for no reason I could adequately explain to my own steward." Eleanor smiled despite herself, warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the winter sun. "I am glad to be an exception, then." "You are considerably more than an exception, Miss Whitmore, though I suspect you already know that." They returned to the subject of the orphaned home before the walk ended, and Julian, to Eleanor's quiet satisfaction, agreed to reconsider the terms of his planned subscription, asking her opinion on how such warmth might be structured into an institution, without sacrificing the order it also required. It was a small thing, in the scale of the season's dramas, but it left Eleanor with a feeling she had rarely known before, the sense of being valued not merely for her presence but for her mind, her opinions taken seriously rather than humored. Her sisters noticed the change in her too, though their reactions differed considerably from one another. Margaret remained warm and encouraging, delighting in every detail Eleanor shared of the Duke's visits, asking eager questions about his manner and his conversation with none of the jealousy Eleanor had half expected. Charlotte, though never unkind, grew quieter on the subject, and Eleanor caught her more than once watching from a window as Julian's carriage departed, an expression on her face that was difficult to read, something between longing and resignation. "Are you unhappy for me?" Eleanor asked her directly one evening, unable to bear the unspoken tension any longer. Charlotte startled, clearly not expecting the question put so plainly. "No," she said, after a pause long enough to suggest she was choosing her words with care. "I am glad for you, truly. I suppose I am only adjusting to a season that has turned out very differently than any of us expected. I spent this year assuming I would be the one attracting serious attention. I find I do not entirely know how to feel, watching that attention go elsewhere, even when I am glad it has gone to you rather than to a stranger who might not deserve it." The honesty startled Eleanor, and she found she respected her sister more for offering it than she would have respected easy, hollow reassurance. "Thank you for telling me plainly," she said. "I would rather know your true feelings than have you pretend contentment you do not feel." "You sound like your Duke," Charlotte said, a faint smile finally breaking through. "He is not my Duke," Eleanor said, though the denial felt weaker than she intended, and Charlotte's smile only widened at the evident lack of conviction behind it. By the time Julian formally requested permission to court Eleanor with an eye toward marriage, the request came as a surprise to no one in the household, least of all Eleanor herself, though the actual asking, when it came, still left her breathless. He asked her directly, in the same garden where he had first told her the truth of his father's old debt, kneeling not out of theatrical performance but out of what seemed to Eleanor a genuine and unguarded sincerity that suited him far better than any grand gesture might have. "I began this because of a promise to my father," he said, holding her hands in both of his despite the winter chill. "I continue it because I cannot imagine my life now without your voice in it, correcting my assumptions, asking me questions no one else thinks to ask, seeing warmth in places I was taught only to see order. Whatever debt I once believed I owed your family, Eleanor, I no longer think of this in those terms at all. I think of it only as wanting you, plainly and entirely, for exactly who you are." Eleanor, who had spent 3 seasons believing herself destined to watch happiness happen to everyone but herself, found she had no clever answer ready, only the simple truth rising unbidden to her lips. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Julian, I would like that very much." It should have been, by every measure, the happiest moment of her season, and for the length of that afternoon, walking back into the house with her hand tucked securely in his, it was. Her mother wept openly, pressing both of Eleanor's hands between her own and murmuring blessings that seemed to come from somewhere far deeper than relief at a secured future. Margaret embraced her twice, then a third time, laughing through tears of her own, declaring that she had known, truly known, from the very moment the Duke crossed the ballroom floor that he had chosen well. Even Charlotte, whose quieter feelings Eleanor understood better now than she had a month earlier, offered a warm and steady embrace, whispering that she was glad, genuinely glad, whatever complicated feelings still lingered beneath the surface of that gladness. That evening, the family gathered for a small private dinner to celebrate, and Eleanor found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely at the center of her own family's joy, rather than watching it unfold around someone else. Her mother spoke of wedding preparations with a brightness that had been absent from the house since before her father's death, and even the servants, usually so careful to remain unseen, could not entirely hide their smiles as they moved about the table. Julian stayed longer than propriety strictly required, lingering after the meal in quiet conversation with Eleanor near the drawing-room window, while her mother pretended, with limited success, to busy herself elsewhere in the room. "Your family is generous," he said quietly. "I did not expect to be received so warmly, given how briefly we have known each other. They have wanted to see me happy for a long time," Eleanor said. "I think tonight they are simply relieved to finally have the chance. And are you happy?" She considered the question seriously, unwilling to offer him anything less than the honest answer he had always asked of her. "I am. Though I confess a small part of me remains wary. waiting for something to disturb it. I have spent 3 seasons learning not to trust good fortune that arrives without warning. Then let me offer you fair warning now, Julian said, a faint smile touching his mouth. I intend to disturb nothing about your happiness, save perhaps your habit of doubting you deserve it. Eleanor laughed softly, surprised by how easily he could still catch her off guard with plain, unadorned honesty. That may take some unlearning. I am prepared to be patient. The following days passed in a warm blur of visits and small celebrations, notes of congratulation arriving from acquaintances who had scarcely acknowledged Eleanor's existence a month earlier, invitations multiplying faster than her mother could properly track them. Eleanor found the sudden attention strange, though considerably easier to bear now that it came paired with Julian's steady presence beside her rather than the isolated scrutiny she had felt on the night of the ball. Not every note that arrived carried warmth, however. Eleanor noticed, though she said nothing of it to her mother, that a handful of invitations which had seemed all but certain now arrived late, or not at all, from hostesses whose daughters had spent the season competing for exactly the kind of attention Eleanor had so unexpectedly received. She recognized the pattern for what it was, the quiet, polite exclusions of society women unwilling to openly voice their displeasure, but equally unwilling to celebrate a match they resented. She mentioned this, carefully, to Margaret one afternoon as they sorted through the growing stack of correspondence together. Lady Ashcombe has not written, Eleanor observed, setting aside a stack of replies to check once more for a name that did not appear, nor Mrs. Pelham, though she called on us twice before the ball season began. Margaret's expression turned thoughtful, less surprised than Eleanor expected. Mrs. Pelham's daughter has been hoping for the Duke's attention since last season, I believe, and Lady Ashcombe is close friends with the Grant family. I would not read too much into a few missing letters, Eleanor, but I would not be entirely surprised if some quarters of society take longer than others to warm to this news. You think Louisa Grant is behind it? I think Louisa Grant is unhappy, Margaret said carefully, and unhappy people in our circles rarely stay quiet for long, whatever face they show in company. Be careful, Eleanor. Not fearful, but careful. I would rather you go into this new chapter with your eyes open than blindsided by unpleasantness you did not see coming. Eleanor took the warning seriously, though she said nothing of it to Julian in the days that followed, unwilling to let a handful of missing invitations dampen a happiness she had waited 3 long seasons to finally claim. Still, the warning lodged itself somewhere quiet in her mind, and she found herself watching the edges of every gathering a little more closely than she once had, aware now that behind the smiles and congratulations, some corners of London had not yet forgiven her for winning a prize so many others had believed belonged to them by right. Late one evening, unable to settle her thoughts enough for sleep, Eleanor sat by her window and watched the quiet street below, empty save for the occasional carriage passing in the distance. She thought of her father, whom she barely remembered speaking of any grand adventures or old debts of honor, a quiet man who had always seemed, to her childhood eyes, more concerned with his ledgers and his roses than with the kind of drama that now seemed to be unfolding around his memory. It struck her, sitting there in the dark, how little she had truly known him, and how strange it was that a single act of courage from decades earlier had reached forward through time to reshape her entire future. She wondered, too, what her father would have made of Julian, whether he would have approved of the man his old act of bravery had ultimately delivered to his daughter's door, or whether he would have simply smiled in that quiet way of his and said nothing at all, content to let events unfold as they would. She liked to imagine the latter. It felt truer to the man she remembered, patient and unshowy, more interested in doing right than in receiving credit for it. Eventually she rose from the window and climbed into bed, her mind still turning over Margaret's warning and the missing invitations, the quiet unease she had not yet named aloud to anyone. Whatever waited ahead, she told herself, she would face it with the same steadiness her father had shown, and the same plain honesty Julian had asked of her from their very first conversation. It was, she thought as sleep finally claimed her, the only way she knew how to move forward, and it would have to be enough. The letter arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, tucked among the usual pile of congratulatory notes, and Eleanor nearly overlooked it entirely before she recognized the handwriting on the outer fold as belonging to her father's old solicitor, a Mr. Hargreaves who had managed the family's dwindling affairs since her father's death. She opened it expecting some dry matter of business, a query about an account or a signature required on some overdue document. What she found instead stopped her breath entirely. The letter referenced, in careful and formal language, a set of old correspondence recently uncovered while sorting through papers belonging to the late Duke of Camden, Julian's father, papers that had apparently been forwarded to Hargreaves for reasons the solicitor did not fully explain. Among them was a private letter written by the elder Duke to a trusted friend, describing his intention, before his death, to see his son married advantageously among the daughters of old, useful families, and mentioning, almost in passing, a debt owed to a Whitmore that might be discharged, the letter suggested, through exactly such a match, sparing the family embarrassment, while securing for his son a connection that carried, whatever its financial poverty, an old and respectable name. Eleanor read the passage 3 times before the meaning settled fully into her chest, cold and heavy, sparing the family embarrassment, discharged through exactly such a match. It was one thing to hear from Julian's own mouth that his father had wished the debt repaid, that he had spoken of it in his final months as a promise Julian felt bound to honor. It was another thing entirely to read, in the old Duke's own hand, language that made the entire courtship sound less like the growing affection Eleanor had believed it to be, and more like a transaction quietly arranged before either she or Julian had ever met. A solution to an old debt dressed up, conveniently, as romance. She sat with the letter for a long time, the morning light shifting slowly across the drawing room floor, before she could bring herself to move at all. When Julian called that afternoon, she said nothing of it at first, unable to find words for the tangle of feelings the letter had stirred loose inside her. He noticed her distraction almost immediately, his usual warmth dimming into concern as he studied her across the drawing room. "Eleanor, what has happened?" She hesitated, torn between the urge to simply show him the letter and the fear of what his reaction might reveal. In the end, honesty won, as it always did between them, and she retrieved the letter from where she had tucked it and placed it silently in his hands. She watched his face as he read it, watched the color shift and the muscle along his jaw tighten as he reached the passage that had undone her that morning. "This changes nothing," he said finally, setting the letter aside, though his voice had lost some of its usual steadiness. "Does it not? Your father wrote of discharging a debt through marriage, Julian, sparing my family embarrassment. That is not the language of a man hoping his son might find love. That is the language of an arrangement, decided before either of us ever spoke a single word to one another. My father wrote a great many things in his final months that reflected his fears more than his hopes," Julian said, though Eleanor heard, beneath the steadiness of his tone, something closer to defensiveness than reassurance. "He was dying, Eleanor, and frightened for what he would leave unfinished. That letter does not reflect the whole of what he told me, nor does it reflect anything of what has happened between us since that first dance. But it does reflect his intention, and you knew of it, did you not, before you ever crossed that ballroom floor?" Julian did not answer immediately, and his silence told her everything his words had not. "I knew he hoped for a match," he admitted finally. "I did not know the exact terms he had written to a friend, not until this moment, but I will not pretend I approached you entirely free of his expectations. I have told you this from the very beginning, Eleanor. I did not hide the debt, or my father's wish that it be honored. You told me you came to the ball because of a promise," Eleanor said, her voice tightening despite her effort to keep it steady. "You did not tell me your father had already decided, before either of us met, that the promise ought to be fulfilled through marriage, to whichever Whitmore daughter would spare your family the least embarrassment in the process. That is not a fair reading of what happened between us, and you know it." "Do I? Because from where I sit, Julian, I have spent weeks believing you saw something in me, something particular to who I am, when perhaps what you truly saw was the most convenient way to satisfy an old obligation your father had already mapped out for you before I ever entered a ballroom." The words landed harder than Eleanor intended, and she saw them land, watched something close off behind Julian's eyes that had been open to her since their very first conversation. "If that is truly what you believe," he said, his voice quiet now, carefully controlled in a way that felt, to Eleanor, more wounding than anger would have been, "then I do not know what else I can say to convince you otherwise. I have told you plainly, every time you have asked, exactly what I felt and why. I cannot control what my father wrote to a friend in the last months of his life, nor can I undo the fact that his wishes and my own feelings happened to align. But I had believed, until this moment, that you knew the difference between an old man's hopeful arrangement and the choice I have made, freely and entirely, since the moment I first spoke to you." Eleanor said nothing, uncertain, in that moment, what she truly believed, and her silence seemed to wound him more deeply than any argument could have. "I will leave you to consider it," he said finally, rising. "But I would ask you to remember, Eleanor, that I have never once lied to you, even when the truth was inconvenient. I told you of the debt from our very first conversation, when I might easily have said nothing at all and let you believe the attraction was simple and uncomplicated. I chose honesty then. I am choosing it now. What you do with that honesty is, I suppose, entirely your own decision to make." He left without another word, and Eleanor sat alone in the darkening drawing room for a long time afterward, the letter still resting on the table where he had set it down, its careful, damning language seeming to grow heavier the longer she stared at it. Word of the strain between them did not take long to spread, though Eleanor could not say precisely how, whether through a careless servant or a solicitor's clerk who had spoken out of turn. By the following week, whispers had begun circulating through the same drawing rooms that had so recently celebrated the match, whispers suggesting the entire courtship had been arranged from its very first moment, a convenient business transaction, dressed in romantic clothing, to spare a duke the indignity of an outright debt repayment. Eleanor first heard the rumor directly from Margaret, who arrived home from a call looking pale and anxious. "They are saying it was arranged," Margaret said without preamble, settling beside Eleanor with evident distress. "That the Duke's father wrote it into some kind of agreement before he died, and that you were chosen not for yourself but simply because you happened to be the daughter with the temperament closest to what the letter described. I told them it was nonsense, Eleanor, but I could see they did not entirely believe me." Eleanor felt the ground shift further beneath her, the private wound of the letter now becoming a public humiliation as well, one that threatened not only her own happiness, but her family's fragile, newly restored standing. "Where did they hear such details?" she asked. The letter itself was addressed to Mr. Hargreaves alone. Margaret hesitated, clearly reluctant to name a source she could not entirely confirm. "Louisa Grant, I believe, though I cannot say how she came to know of it. She has been rather freely discussing it at every gathering this week, always with great sympathy for you, of course, always careful to sound as though she pities rather than delights in your misfortune." Eleanor closed her eyes, understanding at once the full shape of what had happened. Somehow, whether through a careless clerk, a bribed servant, or some other channel entirely, Louisa had gained access to details of the letter, and was now using them, with practiced subtlety, to unravel in public what Eleanor herself had begun to doubt in private. She thought of Julian's face as he had left her drawing room, the careful, wounded control in his voice, and felt, for the first time since the letter arrived, a flicker of shame at how quickly she had let her own fear reshape everything he had told her into something colder and more calculating than she now, in the quiet of reflection, truly believed it to be. But the damage, both private and public, had already been done, and Eleanor understood, with a sinking certainty, that whatever came next would require far more than a quiet apology exchanged in a drawing room. It would require facing, openly and in front of all of London, exactly what kind of truth she was willing to defend, and exactly how much she was willing to risk to defend it. That night, unable to sleep, Eleanor rose and sat once more at her window, the same spot where she had considered her father's memory only weeks earlier, though the comfort she had found there then seemed harder to reach now. She thought of Julian's words, spoken so plainly and so often throughout their courtship, and set them beside the cold language of the letter, trying to hold both truths at once without letting one erase the other. He had told her of the debt from their very first real conversation, in the garden behind her own house, before any promise had been made between them, before any public understanding had bound him to explain himself at all. He had not needed to tell her. He could have let her believe, as she nearly had at first, that his attention was simply admiration, uncomplicated by any old obligation. He had chosen honesty instead, even when honesty made his motives harder to trust rather than easier. She thought, too, of the many small moments since then that a purely transactional arrangement could not easily explain. The care with which he had listened to her opinion on the orphan children's home, revising his own long-held views because her argument had genuinely moved him. The vulnerability in his voice when he admitted his upbringing had taught him discipline but little warmth. The unguarded laugh he had given, more than once, at something she said, a sound she did not believe a man performing an arranged obligation would trouble himself to produce so often or so easily. And yet the letter remained, its language undeniable, proof that whatever had grown between them had begun, at least in part, from a foundation neither of them had chosen freely. She understood now why the discovery had frightened her so deeply. It was not merely the fear that Julian's feelings might be false. It was the older, more familiar fear that had shaped her for 3 long seasons, the fear that she was, in the end, chosen not for herself but for her usefulness, her convenience, her ability to solve a problem someone else had defined for her long before she had any say in the matter. She had spent years believing herself overlooked because she offered nothing remarkable enough to be chosen for her own sake. To discover that even this, the one instance where she had finally been chosen first, might have begun as an arrangement rather than a genuine preference, struck at the oldest and most tender wound she carried. But sitting there in the quiet dark, turning the whole of it over honestly for the first time since the letter arrived, Eleanor began to see the shape of her own error more clearly. She had let an old wound speak louder than the evidence of weeks spent in Julian's company, evidence that had shown her, again and again, a man who listened, who reconsidered his own certainties, who told her difficult truths rather than comfortable lies. She had punished him, in her fear, for his father's old hopes rather than for anything he himself had actually done. It did not erase the sting of the letter entirely, nor did it undo the very real question of how much of their beginning had been shaped by obligation rather than choice. But it clarified at least what she needed to say to him, and what she needed to ask of herself before she said it. She would need to separate, carefully and honestly, the debt his father had hoped to discharge from the man Julian had actually chosen to become in the weeks since. And she would need to trust her own judgment enough to believe the second could be true even if the first had also, once, been real. Whether Julian would still wish to hear any of it, after the coldness with which she had met his honesty that afternoon, she did not yet know. And whether Louisa Grant's whispered campaign would give either of them the chance to repair what had cracked between them before all of London decided the matter for itself, she knew even less. But she resolved, as the first gray light of dawn began creeping over the rooftops beyond her window, that she would not let fear make the choice for her again, whatever the cost of correcting it turned out to be. The Pemberton Ball was, by every account, meant to be the crowning event of the winter season, and it was there, beneath 1,000 candles and the watchful eyes of half of fashionable London, that the quiet rumor Louisa Grant had spent a week cultivating finally bloomed into open confrontation. Eleanor arrived with her mother and sisters already aware of the whispers trailing her, aware of heads turning and conversations dropping to murmurs as she passed. She had grown accustomed, over the previous fortnight, to a certain kind of scrutiny, the curious, admiring attention of a season that had unexpectedly chosen her. This was different. This was the particular, prickling awareness of being watched not with admiration, but with suspicion, as though the entire room had already decided, before she said a single word, that she was a fraud who had schemed her way into a duke's affection through an old family debt. She had not seen Julian since the afternoon of the letter. 5 days now. 5 days of silence that had stretched longer and more painfully than she expected, each hour deepening her resolve to find him and correct what her fear had broken between them, and each hour also deepening her fear that the damage might already be beyond repair. She saw him almost immediately upon entering the ballroom, standing near the far wall in conversation with an older gentleman she did not recognize. He looked, she thought, tired, in a way she had not seen before, the easy warmth she had grown accustomed to in his manner, replaced by something more guarded, more careful. Their eyes met briefly across the room, and something passed between them, uncertain and unresolved, before duty pulled him back into his conversation and pulled Eleanor toward her mother's side. She did not have long to consider how to approach him before Louisa Grant found her first. "Miss Whitmore," Louisa's voice carried further than a private greeting required, pitched precisely for the small cluster of guests near enough to overhear. "How are you managing, with everything that has come to light this week? It must be terribly difficult, discovering the truth of one's own engagement second-hand, through a solicitor's careless letter rather than from the gentleman himself." The words landed with surgical precision, loud enough to draw attention from the surrounding guests, several of whom turned openly now to watch the exchange unfold. "I do not believe my private affairs are a matter for this ballroom, Miss Grant," Eleanor said, keeping her voice level despite the heat rising in her chest. "Of course not," Louisa agreed pleasantly, though her eyes carried none of the warmth her tone suggested. "Though I confess I find it difficult to stay silent when I think of how unfairly you have been used. An old debt, discharged through marriage to whichever daughter happened to suit the arrangement best. It is rather a cold way to begin a life together, is it not? I only wonder whether His Grace ever intended to tell you the whole truth of it, or whether you were meant to learn only what suited the story he wished you to believe." A murmur rippled through the small crowd that had gathered, and Eleanor felt the full, humiliating weight of public scrutiny pressing down on her, every eye in the vicinity now fixed on her face, waiting to see how she would respond to an accusation delivered with such careful, poisonous politeness. She thought, in that moment, of every season she had spent standing silently at the edges of rooms just like this one, absorbing small humiliations without complaint, because complaint had never once changed her circumstances. She thought, too, of the resolve she had reached in the quiet hours before dawn, the promise she had made to herself not to let fear choose her responses any longer. You are half right, Miss Grant, Eleanor said, her voice steady now, carrying further than she had originally intended. There was an old debt. His Grace's father did hope, before his death, to see it repaid through marriage, and I will not pretend otherwise, because I have never once found comfort in pretending. But you are entirely wrong about the rest of it. His Grace told me of that debt himself, plainly and without prompting, on the very first afternoon he called on my family, long before any solicitor's letter forced the matter into the open. He chose honesty when concealment would have served him far better, and he has continued choosing it in every conversation we have had since. If you wish to accuse someone of concealment tonight, Miss Grant, I would ask you to look rather more carefully at your own conduct this past week than at his. The words landed with a force that surprised even Eleanor, and she watched Louisa's carefully composed expression falter, just slightly, before recovering. I am certain I do not know what you mean, Louisa said, though the sharpness in her tone suggested otherwise. I mean that a letter addressed privately to my family's solicitor found its way into the drawing rooms of London with remarkable speed this week, Miss Grant, and I confess I have wondered a great deal how such private correspondence came to be so widely known. The crowd's murmurs shifted now, curiosity turning, subtly but unmistakably, in a new direction, and Eleanor saw, with some satisfaction, a flush of genuine discomfort finally break through Louisa's composure. It was then that Julian arrived, having crossed the ballroom the moment he registered the gathering crowd, and the tension in Eleanor's stance, and the guests parted slightly to allow him through, the ballroom's attention now sharpening further at the sight of the Duke himself joining the confrontation directly. Miss Grant, he said, his voice carrying an authority Eleanor had not heard from him before, cool and precise. I understand there has been considerable discussion this week regarding my late father's private correspondence. I wonder if you might tell me how you came to know its contents in such detail, given that the letter in question was addressed solely to Miss Whitmore's family solicitor. Louisa's composure cracked further under the direct question, delivered in front of an audience now fully attentive to every word. I could not possibly say, Your Grace. One hears things, in society. I meant no harm by repeating what I understood to be common knowledge. It was not common knowledge, Julian said evenly. It was private correspondence, and its sudden appearance in every drawing room I have visited this week suggests rather more deliberate effort than idle gossip typically requires. He turned then, not to Louisa but to Eleanor, and the shift in his expression, from cool authority to something far more vulnerable, silenced the murmuring crowd almost entirely. Miss Whitmore, he said, his voice quieter now, though it carried clearly in the sudden hush. I owe you an apology I should have offered 5 days ago, rather than allowing my own wounded pride to keep me silent. You were right to feel wary of that letter. I understand now why its language frightened you as it did, and I regret that my response, in the moment, made you feel as though your fear was unreasonable rather than understandable. Eleanor felt her breath catch, aware of the entire room watching, aware that whatever was said next would be repeated in every drawing room in London by morning, and finding, to her own surprise, that she no longer cared what any of them thought so long as the words between herself and Julian were finally true. I have had 5 days to consider what I should have said then, she answered, her voice steady despite the audience. My father saved your father's life, and your father hoped, before he died, to see that debt repaid through a marriage he believed would suit his son well. That much is true, and I will not pretend it away simply because it is uncomfortable. But it is not the whole truth of what has grown between us, Julian, and I was wrong to let my own old fears convince me otherwise. You have never once treated me as an obligation to be discharged. You have treated me, from that very first dance, as though my opinions mattered, my company was wanted for its own sake, and my happiness was worth considering apart from any debt owed to my family. I let an old wound speak louder than the evidence of my own eyes, and I am sorry for the pain that caused you. The ballroom had gone entirely silent now, every guest present clearly aware they were witnessing something far more significant than the usual theater of the season. Then may I ask, Julian said, taking a step closer, his voice softening further, whether you would still have me, debt and all, knowing that whatever began as obligation has become, entirely and completely, my own choice? You never needed to ask that a second time, Eleanor said, and felt the tears she had been holding back finally slip free, though she did not care, not tonight, not with the truth finally spoken plainly between them in front of everyone who had doubted it. Julian closed the remaining distance and took her hands in both of his, entirely heedless of the crowd surrounding them, his expression carrying none of the careful reserve she had grown used to seeing him wear in public. Then let me say plainly, in front of everyone gathered here, so that no rumor and no old letter can ever again cast doubt upon it. I did not come to that ballroom weeks ago to discharge a debt, Miss Grant, whatever my father's hopes may have been. I came because I had heard of a woman overlooked by every gentleman in London for reasons that reflected far more poorly on their judgment than on her worth, and I found, the moment I spoke to her, that I did not wish to look anywhere else for the remainder of the evening, or for any evening after it. A murmur of genuine warmth moved through the crowd now, entirely different from the sharp curiosity of moments before, and Eleanor saw, at the edge of the gathering, her mother pressing a handkerchief to her eyes, and Margaret beaming through tears of her own, and even Charlotte, watching with an expression that had finally settled into something like unguarded happiness for her sister. Louisa Grant, for her part, had retreated quietly during the exchange, her earlier confidence entirely dissolved, and Eleanor noticed, with some satisfaction, several of the guests who had gathered to watch now turning toward her, with expressions considerably less sympathetic than they had shown moments before. "I believe," Julian said quietly, for Eleanor's ears alone now, though his hands remained clasped around hers for the entire room to see, "that we have given the season quite enough drama for one evening." "I believe you may be right," Eleanor said, laughing despite the tears still drying on her cheeks, and found, standing there in the center of a ballroom that had once made her feel invisible, that she had never in her life felt more thoroughly and unmistakably seen. The remainder of the evening passed in a strange, warm blur. Well-wishers approached in a steady stream now, many of them the very same hostesses whose invitations had grown scarce over the previous fortnight, each offering congratulations with an eagerness that Eleanor recognized, with some private amusement, as considerably more genuine now that the drama had resolved in her favor rather than her humiliation. She accepted their warmth graciously, though she found she trusted it rather less than she trusted the quiet loyalty her own family and a handful of true friends had shown her throughout the difficult week. Her mother found her during a brief lull in the crowd, embracing her tightly, her voice thick with an emotion that went beyond simple relief. "I was so afraid, Eleanor, watching Miss Grant speak to you like that. I did not know what to do, whether to intervene or trust you to answer for yourself." "You were right to trust me," Eleanor said, and meant it, aware of how new that particular confidence still felt, how recently she had learned to believe her own voice carried enough weight to defend itself in a room full of strangers. "I have always believed it," her mother said quietly. "I am ashamed it took me so long to show you that I believed it." The words settled something old and tender in Eleanor's chest, an ache she had carried since childhood without fully naming it, and she found herself embracing her mother a second time, longer than the first, neither of them entirely able to explain to the other everything the moment meant. Later, as the ball began winding toward its close and the crowd thinned toward the doors, Julian found her once more near the same window where their earlier conversations had so often unfolded, away from the remaining stragglers and the last of the curious glances still trailing her across the room. "You defended yourself admirably tonight," he said, a note of quiet pride in his voice that Eleanor had not heard from him before. "I confess I arrived prepared to defend you myself, only to find you required considerably less rescuing than I expected." "I have had 3 seasons of practice absorbing unkindness silently," Eleanor said. "I found, somewhere in the last 5 days, that I no longer wished to practice silence any further." "I am glad of it," Julian said, "though I am sorry it took my own foolish pride, and my father's old letter, to bring you to that decision." "You need not carry all the blame for that," Eleanor said gently. "I let an old fear speak for me before I gave you the chance to answer it properly. That was my error as much as anything written in your father's letter." He studied her for a long moment, something softening further in his expression. "I meant what I said tonight, in front of the entire room. Whatever began as my father's hope, it is entirely my own choice now, and has been for weeks, long before that letter ever surfaced to test it." "I believe you," Eleanor said, and found, saying the words aloud, that she meant them completely, without the small, wary reservation that had shadowed her happiness since the letter first arrived. "I believe you, Julian, and I am sorry it took a ballroom full of witnesses for me to say so, as plainly as you deserved to hear it days ago." "Then let us agree," he said, taking her hand once more, though gently now, without the audience of moments before, "that whatever tests still await us, and I suspect Miss Grant's wounded pride will not disappear entirely overnight, we face them together, and plainly, exactly as we have tried to do from that very first dance." "Together," Eleanor agreed, "and plainly." They stood together by the window for a while longer, watching the last of the ball's guests depart into the cold night beyond, and Eleanor found, for the first time since the letter's arrival 5 days earlier, that the fear which had shadowed her happiness had finally, entirely, lifted, replaced by something steadier and far more certain than anything she had known before. The following morning, as if the ballroom confrontation had settled the matter for the whole of London at once, the flow of invitations resumed its earlier eagerness, and Eleanor noticed, with quiet satisfaction rather than triumph, that even Lady Ashcombe's household sent word of a call planned for later that week. She did not begrudge the sudden warmth, though she understood it for what it was, the fickle tide of a society quick to follow whichever story proved most fashionable to repeat. What mattered far more to her was the steadiness she had found in herself, and in Julian, over the course of that single difficult evening, a steadiness she suspected would serve her far longer than any passing fashion of society's approval ever could. Yet even as the household settled back into its new and easier rhythm, Eleanor could not entirely shake a small, persistent unease. Louisa Grant had retreated from the ballroom in evident humiliation, but a woman who had gone to such lengths to obtain and spread private correspondence did not strike Eleanor as the sort to accept defeat quietly. Whatever quiet campaign had produced that leaked letter in the first place, Eleanor suspected, was not yet fully finished, and she resolved to remain watchful, whatever peace the evening had otherwise restored. The truth, when it finally surfaced fully, arrived not through gossip or careful confrontation, but through the quiet, methodical work of Mr. Hargreaves, whose sense of professional propriety had been deeply offended by the discovery that a letter entrusted to his care had somehow found its way into the drawing rooms of London. He called on Eleanor's family himself, a week after the Pemberton ball, his expression grave beneath his usual careful courtesy. "I have traced the matter, Miss Whitmore, and I felt it my duty to inform you directly, rather than allow further speculation to circulate unchecked. My clerk, a young man named Edmund Talbot, confessed to me yesterday that he had shared the contents of the letter with an acquaintance in exchange for a sum of money. He did not know, or claims he did not know, the full extent of the damage such a disclosure would cause. The acquaintance in question was in the employ of the Grant household." Eleanor absorbed the confirmation with less surprise than she expected, though the specifics still stung. "You are certain of this?" "Quite certain. Talbot has been dismissed, of course, and I have offered my sincerest apologies for the failure of discretion within my own office. I understand it caused you considerable distress, and I am deeply sorry for any part my household played in that." Julian, who had arrived shortly before the solicitor and remained for the conversation, thanked Hargreaves with a quiet formality that did not entirely disguise the anger beneath it. "I do not hold you responsible, Hargreaves. A dishonest clerk is not a reflection of your own integrity. But I intend to ensure that Miss Grant understands the consequences of paying for stolen correspondence, whatever social standing her family believes protects her from such consequences." What followed, over the subsequent fortnight, unfolded with the particular swiftness of a society eager to correct its own earlier misjudgment. Word of the bribed clerk spread nearly as quickly as the original rumor had, carried by a solicitor's profession every bit as gossip-prone as the ballrooms it served. And this time the sympathy of London turned decisively and permanently against Louisa Grant rather than against Eleanor. The Grant family, faced with the very real prospect of public disgrace, withdrew from society for the remainder of the season, and Eleanor heard, through channels she did not entirely trust but had little reason to doubt, that Louisa had been sent to stay with distant relatives in the countryside until the scandal cooled sufficiently for her to reappear without immediate censure. Eleanor took no particular satisfaction in the news. She had spent enough seasons feeling overlooked and unwanted to recognize something of that same desperate hunger for attention in Louisa's cruelty, however unkindly it had been expressed, and she found she could not entirely hate a woman whose worst crime, beneath the scheming, had been wanting badly enough to be chosen that she had been willing to hurt someone else to secure it. "You are more generous toward her than I could manage," Julian observed one afternoon, when Eleanor shared this reflection during a quiet walk through the same garden where he had first told her the truth of his father's old debt. "I do not excuse what she did," Eleanor said, "only that I understand, better than most, how it feels to watch someone else receive attention you believe belongs to you. I spent 3 seasons resenting my own sisters for exactly that feeling, quietly, though I never acted on it as she did. There is a considerable difference between private resentment and bribing a solicitor's clerk to steal correspondence." "There is," Eleanor agreed. "I only mean that I can see the shape of the wound beneath the unkindness, even if I cannot forgive the unkindness itself." Julian considered this in silence for a while, something thoughtful in his expression. "You continue to surprise me, Eleanor. I do not believe I have ever met anyone so willing to extend understanding to someone who tried so deliberately to harm her." Perhaps that is simply what happens to a person who spends 3 seasons learning to forgive being overlooked, Eleanor said. It teaches a strange kind of patience, even toward people who do not entirely deserve it. Their wedding, when it finally arrived in early spring, took place in a modest church not far from the Whitmore family's unfashionable street, a choice Julian had insisted upon over the grander cathedral his own family's standing might have commanded. "I did not fall in love with you at a grand cathedral," he had told her, when she questioned the choice. "I fell in love with you at the edge of a crowded ballroom, in a modest garden, in conversations about orphan children and old debts. I would rather be married somewhere that reflects the truth of how we found each other, than somewhere that merely reflects my title." The church, though smaller than fashion demanded, filled entirely with guests, family, and a surprising number of society figures who had, over the winter months, come to genuinely admire the quiet resilience Eleanor had shown throughout the season's difficulties. Her mother wept through the entire ceremony, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief that had long since lost any pretense of usefulness. Margaret stood as her attendant, glowing with unreserved happiness, while Charlotte, seated in the front pew, watched with an expression that had settled, over the winter months, into something entirely free of the earlier ambivalence, replaced instead by a steady, generous joy for her sister that Eleanor had come to treasure deeply. Standing before the altar, watching Julian's face as she approached, Eleanor found herself thinking, unexpectedly, of that first evening months earlier, standing at the edge of a ballroom in a pale gray gown, watching yet another gentleman's eyes slide past her toward her sister's. She thought of the years of quiet invisibility that had preceded this moment, the small daily erosions of being consistently overlooked, and she felt, standing there in the church's soft spring light, an overwhelming gratitude not merely for Julian's love, though that gratitude ran deep and true, but for the version of herself who had endured those quiet years without losing the capacity to recognize genuine warmth when it finally arrived. "I did not come to that ballroom for your sisters," Julian said quietly, as she reached his side, echoing words he had spoken to her months before, though this time in front of every witness who mattered, rather than in the privacy of a single dance. "I came for you, Eleanor. I have never once regretted it, and I never will." "I know," Eleanor said, and found she truly did know it now, entirely and without reservation. The last shadow of doubt the old letter had cast, finally and completely dissolved. "I know, Julian, and I choose you in return, plainly and entirely, exactly as you once chose me." The ceremony proceeded with the quiet, unhurried warmth that had come to characterize their entire courtship, and when Julian finally lifted her veil to kiss her before the assembled witnesses, the church erupted in a warmth of applause and tears that Eleanor would carry with her for the rest of her life, a sound entirely unlike the whispered scrutiny of the ballroom where their story had begun. In the years that followed, Eleanor often thought back on that difficult winter, the letter, the confrontation, the quiet fear that had nearly cost her the happiness she eventually claimed so fully. She used the memory, more than once, to comfort other young women she encountered in society, who found themselves similarly overlooked, similarly convinced that beauty and easy charm were the only qualities that ever secured genuine attention. She told them, whenever the opportunity arose, that the right person, when he finally arrived, would not need to be pulled across a crowded room by anything so simple as a pretty face, that he would come instead for the quieter qualities so easily missed in a room full of louder, brighter performances: patience, honesty, warmth offered without expectation of return. Margaret married 2 years later, a kind and steady gentleman she had met, fittingly enough, at Eleanor's own wedding, and Charlotte, in time, found her own happiness, with a scholar who valued her sharp mind above the golden curls that had once drawn every eye in a ballroom toward her. The 3 sisters remained close throughout their lives, the old rivalries of that difficult season having long since dissolved into a bond considerably stronger and more honest than the polite competition that had once defined their relationship. Eleanor's mother, in her final years, often told the story of that first dance to anyone willing to listen, embellishing the details a little more with each retelling, until the tale had grown into something closer to legend than memory. Eleanor never corrected the embellishments, finding a particular tenderness in watching her mother's evident pride in a daughter she had once, however unintentionally, allowed to feel invisible. And Julian, true to the promise he had made in that quiet garden so many years before, never once let Eleanor doubt again that she had been chosen for herself alone, and not for any debt, any convenience, or any obligation inherited from a father's dying wish. He told her often, in the years that followed, that the greatest fortune of his life had not been his title or his fortune, considerable as both were, But the evening he had crossed a crowded ballroom and found, at its farthest edge, the one woman in the entire room worth choosing. Eleanor, for her part, never forgot the years of being overlooked, but she came, in time, to understand them differently, not as evidence of her own unworthiness, but as the quiet, patient waiting that had shaped her into exactly the woman capable of recognizing genuine love when it finally arrived, and strong enough, when it was tested, to fight for it plainly and without apology. It was, she often reflected, a far better story than simply being chosen first among many. It was the story of being chosen last, and finding that the choice, when it finally came, was worth every quiet season that had come before it. Their first year of marriage settled into a rhythm neither of them had fully anticipated, quieter in some ways than the drama of their courtship, and considerably richer for it. Julian's estate, which Eleanor had imagined from a distance as something grand and unwelcoming, revealed itself instead as a home of considerable warmth once she began, gradually, to make it her own. She redesigned the orphan children's charity her husband had once discussed with her in Hyde Park, insisting on precisely the balance of structure and warmth she had argued for that winter afternoon, and within 2 years the institution had become a model referenced by similar charities throughout the country. Its success owed, in no small part, to a young duchess who understood, from her own experience, exactly what it meant for a child to feel unseen. Her mother visited often in those early years, and Eleanor watched, with quiet satisfaction, as the woman who had once measured her daughter's worth primarily by the suitors they attracted, slowly learned to value them for qualities entirely their own. It was not a perfect transformation, and old habits occasionally resurfaced in moments of stress, but Eleanor found she could forgive the lapses more easily now, understanding better than she once had how deeply fear for a family's survival could distort even a mother's deepest love. Julian, for his part, grew steadily less guarded as the years passed, the careful reserve Eleanor had first encountered at that fateful ball gradually softening into an ease she had glimpsed only occasionally during their courtship. He laughed more easily. He spoke more often of his father, not merely the old debt and its careful language, but warmer memories too. Small kindnesses the old Duke had shown in quieter moments that his letters had never fully captured. Eleanor came to understand, over time, that Julian's father had likely loved his son deeply, in the imperfect, duty-bound language available to a man of his generation and position, and that the cold phrasing of that damaging letter had reflected fear and hope tangled together rather than any absence of genuine feeling. She thought often, too, of Louisa Grant, whose story did not end entirely unhappily, whatever the immediate consequences of that difficult winter. Word reached Eleanor some years later that Louisa had eventually married a gentleman of modest but respectable fortune, a match considerably quieter than the grand alliance she had once hoped to secure for herself, but one that friends who knew the couple described as genuinely contented. Eleanor found herself glad of the news when it reached her, free at last of any lingering resentment toward a woman whose cruelty, however real and however costly, had sprung from a hunger Eleanor understood better than most. When Eleanor's own daughter was born, 2 years into the marriage, Julian held the child with a tenderness that erased, in a single evening, any last trace of the cold, dutiful reserve Eleanor had first mistaken for his true nature at that first ball. He named her, at Eleanor's quiet request, after her father, choosing a name that honored the quiet, unshowy courage of a man who had never sought credit for the life he had once saved, and who could not have known, in that long-ago moment of danger, that his simple act of decency would one day secure his daughter's entire happiness. Eleanor often told her own daughter, once the girl was old enough to understand, that beauty and easy charm might draw a room's attention quickly, but that lasting love was built from steadier things, patience, honesty, and the courage to speak plainly even when plain speech carried risk. She told her, too, of the ballroom where a duke had crossed the entire length of a crowded room to reach the sister everyone else had overlooked, not because that sister was the most beautiful woman present, but because she was the one worth truly seeing. It became, in time, the story their family told most often, repeated at holidays and anniversaries, until every detail had been polished smooth by affectionate retelling, and Eleanor never tired of hearing it, no matter how many times the years brought it back around. She had spent 3 long seasons believing herself destined to remain invisible, standing quietly at the edges of rooms that celebrated everyone but her. She had learned, in the end, that being overlooked by many was not the same as being unworthy of being seen, and that sometimes the truest kind of love arrived not with fanfare or immediate certainty, but slowly, plainly, and only once someone finally took the trouble to look closely enough to notice what had been there, waiting quietly, all along. Years later, when her own daughter approached her first season, nervous and uncertain the way every young woman entering society tends to be, Eleanor sat with her the evening before her first grand ball and offered the only advice she felt truly qualified to give. "You will watch other girls receive attention you believe you deserve more than they do," she told her daughter, smoothing a stray curl back from the girl's forehead with the same tenderness her own mother had shown too rarely and too late. "You will wonder, some evenings, whether anyone in the room sees you at all. I want you to remember, when those evenings come, that being seen quickly is not the same as being seen truly, and that the second kind of seeing is worth waiting for, however long the waiting takes." "Is that what happened with you and father?" her daughter asked, though she had heard the story countless times already and knew the answer as well as she knew her own name. "That is exactly what happened," Eleanor said, smiling at the familiar question. "I spent 3 seasons certain I would never be chosen first at anything, and then, one evening, the right person crossed an entire ballroom to prove me wrong, and I understood, for the first time, that being chosen last simply meant being chosen by someone who took the time to look carefully enough to be certain." Her daughter carried that advice with her into the season ahead, and though her own story unfolded rather differently, without dukes or old debts or dramatic confrontations in crowded ballrooms, she carried, throughout it, the same quiet steadiness her mother had fought so hard to claim for herself. A steadiness that had become, by then, the truest inheritance Eleanor had to offer. And so the family story continued, generation folding gently into generation, each retelling adding its own small warmth to a tale that had begun, so many years before, with a young woman standing overlooked at the edge of a crowded ballroom, and a duke who had looked past every celebrated beauty in the room, to find, at last, the one worth choosing above all the rest. 5 years into their marriage, a letter arrived that Eleanor had never expected to receive, addressed in a hand she did not recognize, postmarked from a small coastal town she had never visited. She opened it in the quiet of her morning room, curious rather than alarmed, and found the contents far more moving than she had anticipated. The letter came from a woman named Alice Aldridge, no relation to Eleanor's own sister despite the shared name, who explained that she had been a resident of the orphan children's home Eleanor had spent years reshaping according to her own hard-won convictions about warmth and structure. She had grown up within those walls as a small girl, arriving frightened and grieving after losing both parents to fever, and had left the institution years later as a confident young woman, now married with children of her own, entirely because, she wrote, someone had finally taken the trouble to notice her. "I do not know if you will remember me," the letter read, "but you visited our home when I was perhaps 9 years old, not long after the new rules were put in place. I remember you kneeling down to speak with me directly, rather than over my head to the matron as most visitors did, and asking me what I enjoyed, as though my answer genuinely mattered to you. No one had asked me such a question since my mother passed. I have thought of that small kindness many times over the years, and I wished, now that I am settled and happy, to thank you properly for it." Eleanor read the letter twice, then a third time, feeling something warm and unexpected rise in her chest. She had visited the home countless times over the years, kneeling to speak with countless children whose faces she could no longer individually recall, never imagining that any single conversation might have lodged itself so deeply in a child's memory that it would resurface, years later, as a turning point worth writing to thank her for. She showed the letter to Julian that evening, and watched his expression soften as he read it. "You built something that outlasted the moment," he said quietly, folding the letter carefully and returning it to her. "I do not think either of us fully understood, when you first argued with me in that park about discipline and warmth, how far the consequences of that conversation would eventually travel. I only said what I believed," Eleanor said. "I did not imagine it would change anything beyond your own subscription to a single charity." "That is often how the most important changes happen," Julian said, quietly, and without anyone fully realizing, at the time, how far the ripples will eventually spread. Eleanor kept the letter afterward in a small drawer in her writing desk, alongside a handful of other correspondence she treasured, and she found herself returning to it occasionally in quieter moments, a reminder of how far her own life had traveled since that first difficult season of feeling perpetually overlooked. It was not long after the letter's arrival that Eleanor found herself unexpectedly face-to-face with Louisa Grant once more, now Louisa Fairweather, at a charity event neither woman had anticipated the other attending. The years had softened whatever sharp edges had once defined their rivalry, and Eleanor, watching Louisa approach across the crowded hall, felt none of the old wariness she might once have expected. "Your Grace," Louisa said, offering a curtsy that carried genuine respect, rather than the practiced civility of their earlier acquaintance. I did not expect to see you here. Nor I you, Eleanor admitted, though not unkindly. I hear congratulations are in order. Your husband's charitable work has been spoken of quite favorably these past months. Something flickered across Louisa's face, gratitude mixed with old embarrassment. Thank you. I confess I have often thought of writing to you, these past years, to offer some proper apology for the pain I caused you during that difficult winter. I never found the courage, and then too much time passed, and it seemed easier to simply let the silence stand. You need not apologize now, if the words are difficult to find, Eleanor said gently. I understood, even then, something of what drove your unkindness, though understanding it did not make it hurt any less at the time. I was frightened, Louisa admitted quietly, glancing away toward the crowded hall, as though the confession cost her considerable effort. Frightened of being overlooked myself, in a season that had always promised me the attention I believed I deserved. I handled that fear terribly, and I have regretted it more than you likely know. We were both frightened, I think, Eleanor said. Only my fear made me quiet, and yours made you cruel. Neither response served either of us particularly well in the end. Louisa studied her for a long moment, something like genuine warmth finally breaking through the old reserve between them. You are more generous than I deserve, Your Grace. Perhaps, Eleanor said, smiling faintly. Or perhaps I simply learned, somewhere along the way, that holding on to old wounds serves no one, least of all the person carrying them. I find I would rather spend my energy on my own happiness than on remembering yours. They parted amicably after that, not quite friends, but no longer adversaries either, and Eleanor found, walking away from the conversation, a lightness she had not expected. The last small shadow of that difficult winter finally, fully dissolved. That evening, recounting the exchange to Julian as they prepared for bed, Eleanor found herself reflecting on how completely her life had transformed since that first evening at the ball, when she had stood invisible at the edge of a crowded room, certain her story would always be one of being overlooked rather than chosen. Do you ever think of that first night? She asked him, settling beside him as the candles burned low. Often, he admitted. I think, most of all, of how close I came to simply repaying my father's debt through some distant formal gesture, a letter of introduction, an invitation extended and forgotten, rather than crossing that ballroom myself. I think of how easily I might have missed you entirely, hiding as you were behind that curtain, holding a glass of lemonade you never once drank. You noticed that? I noticed everything about you that evening, Julian said, his voice warm in the quiet dark. I have wondered since whether it was truly my father's old promise that drew me across the room, or whether some instinct entirely my own recognized, even from a distance, that you were the one person in that ballroom, actually worth the crossing. Does it matter now which it was? No, Julian said, drawing her closer. It does not matter at all now, only that I found you, and that whatever brought me to your side that first evening, nothing has kept me there since except my own certain wish to remain. Eleanor fell asleep that night thinking of the letter from the young woman she had once knelt to speak with as a child, of Louisa's quiet, hard-won apology, of her own daughter's coming season, and the steadiness she hoped to pass along, and of the long, winding path that had carried her from an overlooked corner of a crowded ballroom to a life she had once believed entirely beyond her reach. She understood now, with a clarity that had taken years of quiet seasons to earn, that being overlooked had never been the whole of her story, only its difficult beginning, and that the truest measure of any life lay not in how quickly it was noticed, but in how faithfully it was lived once someone finally took the trouble to look. The following spring, Eleanor wrote back to Alice Aldridge, inviting her and her family to visit the estate should their travels ever bring them near enough, and was delighted, some months later, to receive word that the invitation had been accepted. Alice arrived on a warm afternoon in early summer, accompanied by a husband of quiet good humor and two small children, who immediately set about exploring the gardens with the fearless curiosity Eleanor remembered well from her own childhood visits to grander houses than her family's modest townhouse had ever been. I confess I was nervous to come, Alice admitted, once the children had been settled with tea and the adults had found a quiet corner of the drawing room to themselves. I did not know if the memory would mean as much to you as it meant to me, or whether you would find my letter, in retrospect, rather a strange thing for a stranger to send. It meant a great deal to me, Eleanor said honestly, more perhaps than you realize. I spent a difficult season, once, wondering whether the small, quiet kindnesses I offered people ever truly mattered to anyone beyond the moment itself. Your letter answered that question rather more thoroughly than years of my own uncertainty ever had. Alice smiled, visibly moved. Then I am glad I finally found the courage to send it. They spent the remainder of the afternoon in easy conversation, Alice describing the modest, contented life she had built for herself. A small cottage near the sea, a husband who worked as a schoolmaster, 2 children who filled their days with noise and laughter she had once feared, as an orphan child, she might never know for herself. Eleanor listened with genuine delight, recognizing in Alice's quiet happiness something of her own hard-won contentment, built not from grand titles or dramatic ballroom confrontations, but from the steady, patient accumulation of small choices made honestly, day after day, until an entire life had been built upon them. When the visit ended and Alice's family departed down the long drive toward the main road, Eleanor stood beside Julian at the entrance of the house, watching the carriage disappear into the summer haze. "You have built a great many things since that first ball," Julian said quietly, slipping his arm around her waist. "A marriage, a family, a charity that has changed the lives of children neither of us will ever fully know the names of. I find myself endlessly grateful I happened to cross that particular ballroom on that particular evening." "As am I," Eleanor said, leaning into him with the easy comfort of years spent learning exactly how well they fit together. "Though I have come to believe, watching everything that has grown from that one evening, that it was never truly about the crossing itself, only about what we both chose to build once you finally arrived." They stood together a while longer in the fading summer light, watching the empty drive where Alice's carriage had disappeared, both of them quietly aware that the story which had begun so many years earlier, with an overlooked young woman standing at the edge of a crowded ballroom, had grown into something far larger and far more lasting than either of them could have imagined on that first uncertain evening. A story still unfolding, still adding new chapters, in the lives of every person it had touched along the way.